Good evening. My name is DeKalb Walcott. I'm a retired battalion chief for the Chicago Fire Department. I served 31 years as a Chicago fireman. The book that I wrote is called Black Heroes of Fire. Black Heroes of Fire represents black firefighters from Chicago, dated back to 1872. Chicago was the first in the nation during the Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1876, where Chicago was one of the only cities who adopted a black fire company. The book that I wrote is very interesting. It's interesting because a lot of people don't know the different stories that come out of the Firehouse relative to Engine 21. But I'll tell you some parts about the book before I start talking about 21. Originally, when this country was first formed, back in the 1700s, you notice, well, they had what was called bucket brigades. People would form long lines. Everybody was required to have their own bucket. They would bring the bucket to the fire, they'd dump it in the water and pass that bucket in a line until they got to the fire. Now, most of the structures and buildings then were not, of course, as large as they are today. So as a result, it didn't require as much water, but it was still an antiquated method of trying to put a fire out. So as we know, the old country, at that time, the only people that were in America, for the most part, were African slaves, Indians, and whites who were from Great Britain and maybe some other handful of other countries. So let's move fast forward. Let's go to approximately 1817, 1820 era. Blacks served as slaves and as freedmen on fire departments such as Macon, Charleston, Savannah. And while serving on those companies, those groups made up at least half of the fire company. Conversation was then that blacks took part. They were no longer a bucket brigade at that time. They had hose carts that they pulled down the street, dumped water in them, and they had levers on both sides that they would work, and that would move the water through the hose line into the pipe. So, in spite of that, Charleston, Savannah, Macon, those places would not have been able to sustain their cities without those black firemen. Now, the irony in this is that those in the North discouraged blacks from becoming firemen. They discouraged them. An example would be 1818 Philadelphia, where the African Firemen's Association attempted to organize their own volunteer group. The volunteer firemen in that city would not allow them. They were threatened with violence, bombings, fires, and a work stoppage. And so in the end, these men decided that it wasn't worth it and that they discontinued their search to create their own fire company. So let's move fast forward. So we're moving from 1830, 1840, up until, let's go after the Civil War. The war ended in 1865, and as a result, black slaves relocated across the country. Many of them moved not far from where they lived at that time, but there were some who found their way into places like suburbs of Chicago and other small communities, Alton, Cairo, and so on. Now, approximately 1865 to 1876 was what was called a Reconstruction era in America. That period involved where laws were written to correct the slave problem, so to speak. Those laws that were created granted blacks their freedom, voting rights, and equal rights. Much of that was taken away through what was called Jim Crow laws in the it started primarily after Reconstruction ended in 1876. Engine 21 had in Chicago had a brave mayor called Mayor Medill. Mayor Joseph Medill was, he was president, executive director of the Chicago Tribune. He was an abolitionist. He was a friend to President Lincoln, and after the Great Chicago Fire, October 8, 1871, he became the mayor of Chicago. So, after becoming mayor of Chicago in December of 1871, he was an advocate for blacks. And because hiring blacks, there were problems with blacks getting jobs for the most part, living conditions and so on. So in 1872, he did three things. He established the first black police officer. He helped John Jones get elected as Cook County Commissioner. And then he also, by December 21st, 1872, he created the fire company Engine 21. Engine 21 was manned by black firemen, a black assistant foreman, a white engineer, Henry Pethybridge, and a white commander, foreman, called David B. Kenyon. Well, this fire company was established as a result of Mayor Medill's hard work to reform Chicago, and following the Great Chicago Fire, a lot of things, the economic situation here was shut down, and because of the I'm looking for a word here, because white society in Chicago did not want to hire blacks as firemen and policemen, Mayor Medill did not accept the fire department's annual reports for those years of 1872 up to 1874. Now, he also tried to fire the police commissioner, commander, as well as I think the police board headed up the fire and police board. So he would not take their annual reports because of their refusal to hire blacks in the Chicago Fire Department. He established this fire company through an executive order, and they became established again December 21st, 1872. This fire company, in order for them to survive, they had to be better than the other fire companies. They had to be better because people were looking for a reason to get rid of them. So might I add to you that there were no other black fire companies. When I say a fire company, I mean a full complement of men, be that 5 or 7 firemen, not including the officers. Places like Indianapolis in 1876, they hired a couple of black firemen, but no whole company. It was not until approximately 1889 or so when Columbus, Ohio had a black fire company. New York hired its first in about 1898, but he only survived for approximately 4 years. He only survived for 4 years because he was made to work in the basement, never really given a skill level, and he was asked to manage the horses, and that's about it. So he became frustrated and quit. And that doesn't include the hazing that went on in the firehouse. So as a result, Engine 21 went on to do a number of things here in Chicago. The invention of the sliding pole, Firehouse sliding pole, came from this fire company, Engine 21, David B. Kenyon and its members. They set records in Chicago throughout the late 1800s. They responded to the most fires in the city, they responded to the most runs in the city, and they had the most work time, which means that they stayed very busy. Now, a lot of folks do not know, but the invention of the Firehouse sliding pole came, and it was as a result of this particular fire company here. This is an example of what that wooden pole would have looked like today. It was a piece of wood that was made of Georgia pine. It was a 4x4 piece. The corners were cut off. It was rounded to a 3-inch round, and shellac and paraffin was added. Paraffin was a slippery substance like grease, and it was used to make that pole slippery. So this is what helped Engine 21 to lead Chicago in runs and fires and being first in at fires. So a part of the spirit de corps for the fire department in Chicago is, you know, when the bell goes off, many of us get up and we're trying to get to wherever you are, wherever help is needed as fast as we can so that we can help out in any way possible, be that fires, floods, whatever the case may be. There's a story about the fire pole, how it originated. Approximately 1876, 1877, Engine 21 had moved and relocated to 1213 South Plymouth Court. Plymouth Court is 1 block west of State Street. Okay, so if you go to Roosevelt and you go a half a block over, that street is Plymouth Court. It's a north and a south street. Well, 1213 South Plymouth Court, Engine 21 relocated into from 9th and 9th Street off of State and 9th Street. Once they relocated, they were in this particular firehouse, and this was a 3-story firehouse. There was a hayloft that was located on the 3rd floor. 3rd floor hayloft, there was a diagonal pole that ran from the 3rd floor to the main apparatus floor. That pole was used to hoist hay and other items up to that storage area. Well, at this particular time, they were hoisting hay up to the 3rd floor, and an alarm came in. When that alarm came in, many of the members that were up there working took the stairs. The other individual, George Reed, slid that diagonal pole to the main floor, and he was able to hook up the horses, and he was ready to go out the door by the time the other members had come downstairs. So he was asked when they returned from whatever incident they participated in, and he was asked, "How'd you get down so fast?" He said, "I slid the pole." So David B Kenyon, he was a carpenter prior to participating in the Civil War and becoming a fireman. He had this idea of cutting a hole in the floor and attaching this wooden pole to it, and so members could slide that pole down to the main floor for quicker response times. Well, because of their record for being first in, by 1878, the fire department annual report stated that sliding poles were being installed throughout Chicago firehouses because it increased the members' response time. So following those years, Engine 21 again went on to lead Chicago in first in at fires. They responded to more fires than anyone else in Chicago, any other fire company, and they had more work time than any other. So again, they were very busy. Now, this picture that I have here is a picture that I was allowed to use by David B. Kenyon's grandson. He allowed me to use that picture on the front of my book and in this plaque as well. There's a short story here about Engine 21, where they were located, the members' names, and also where the concept of the fire pole originated. Now, by 1880, this fire pole was taken out of service. It was taken out of service because wood has a maintenance problem. After sliding a number of times on this pole, people started developing or getting splinters as a result. So by 1880, Boston created what was a brass pole. And so obviously you didn't have the maintenance problems that you have with wood. So that's kind of how the story got misconstrued and misconcepted, because whereas the concept, the idea of the fire pole came out of Chicago, Boston picked it up, and most people assume that they created the invention. They thought of the They created the fire pole, but they did not. So, story goes on, talks about how Engine 21 was the only black company in Chicago for at least up until 1943. 1930 to 1936, they had temporarily had a second fire company, which was Truck 11. Now, back in the 1800s, all the way up until early 1900s, these men lived in the firehouse. There was no such thing as getting a day off. They lived constantly. They would go home and visit. Family members would come down and visit. But until about 1905 or so, they lived in the firehouse. After 1905, they created a second shift. So this second shift allowed members to go home, relax, get some rest, and come back to work the following day. By 1956 or so, we developed a third shift, which allowed our members 2 days off. So you would work one day and you would be off two. It wasn't until 1923 when Chicago, I should say Engine 21, found its first black commander, who was Joseph Wheatcliff. Joseph Wheatcliff was originally from Kentucky. He was promoted to lieutenant on Engine 21 in 1917, and he was promoted to captain by 1923. So this company, Engine 21, relocated from a downtown residence in the railroad yard at 47 West Taylor. They relocated from that location because of problems in the firehouse. Firehouse fell in disrepair, so they relocated its members to further south side in an area called Bronzeville. A lot of us know about Bronzeville, but the migration of blacks in Chicago started from a downtown area. The greatest concentration of blacks at that time was from Roosevelt Road to Van Buren, from State Street to 4th Avenue. So 4th Avenue may be Clark, maybe LaSalle Street, right, from State to LaSalle. So that square area there had numerous homes, a lot of shacks, shanties. Chicago was full of wood houses, which was a problem. That's what stimulated the first fire. The insurance board and the fire department got together and they outlawed the building of wood houses in the downtown area, particularly after the second Great Fire. The second Great Fire was the so-called Black Fire, when the black section of town burned down in Chicago in that square area that I mentioned to you. Well, those people relocated from the area that they were burned out in, and they started a movement up South State Street. So they occupied whatever houses were available on State Street. We'll go from Roosevelt Road up until about 16th Street. And then their movement continued further south. So we'll go from Roosevelt Road to, let's go to 31st Street approximately. And so that was considered a black belt. There were nothing but blacks that lived there. And so you would go 2 blocks east or west, and blacks consumed that area, and that was considered the black belt. It wasn't considered Bronzeville until later in 1920s, 1930s. So by 1926, this fire company, Engine 21, still only one black fire company as a result of segregation, relocated to 3444 South Rhodes Avenue in the heart of Bronzeville. This fire company housed what was called high pressure rig number 7 in their quarters as well, in order to augment their manpower. Again, I made mention of 1930 to 1936. Truck 11 was temporarily, had 1 shift black and 1 shift white. By 1936, that fire company went back to being all white. So part of our history in Chicago here has been to adapt and to overcome. A lot of what had gone on prior till was racism, discrimination, sexism, you name it. Let's see. This is a logo that a friend of mine, David Banks, created about 25 years ago, and he hung it on my wall. He sketched it by pencil. I kept it on my wall for a number of years. When I wrote the book, I adopted this as my logo. Very nice picture, excellent artist, and I thank Dave for that. This book, during the fire strike of 1980, I kept hearing these stories, and afterwards I kept hearing these stories about this black fire company who invented the Firehouse sliding pole. But there was nothing written down, nothing that was in writing. So I collected as much data as I could from that time period up until about 4 or 5 years ago, and then I started working on this book. Because this is the only book in the nation like this. Chicago has the only black history of its firefighters. Many other areas have information, but nothing in a book form. And I'm hoping that others duplicate these efforts and create their own book and tell their own story. Do you guys have any questions?
No.
Not one?
You know how this book affect like the fire company, just like today for Chicago?
So be a little bit more specific. How does it affect them? Well, it's a proudful book for blacks. You know, our numbers have been low in the Chicago Fire Department from day one. We've had, let's see, 1973, there was a lawsuit that was instituted against the city of Chicago for its racist hiring practices of not hiring blacks, not promoting blacks on the fire department. And seeing that our tenure had carried us from 1872 to 1973, that's 100 years. So for not allowing blacks to serve in the fire service and not promoting them, this lawsuit tended to change things. So everybody's opinion's not the same. Some people felt that they were being spited in light of the fact that blacks were being promoted ahead of them, but not identifying with the fact that there was this 100-year period where we only had one fire company and no blacks were really promoted. Black firemen are very grateful for the book, and that's on a national level, I've come to find out. We have an organization called the International Association of Black Professional Firefighters. Many blacks throughout the nation are buying the book to find out what's in it, and obviously also to write their own book as well. So, come on, you got to have a question.
No, I don't.
Well, let me relate a little bit here. Now, 1973, there was a lawsuit in Chicago. 1977, after Mayor Daly's death, we hired the first black through affirmative action. That court case went into court originally for black firemen, black men, because that's what they were hiring at the time. Women did not start getting hired in the nation until about 1974 or so. But through our lawsuit, women and other minorities, Hispanics, Orientals, and so on, have been able to obtain jobs in the fire service as a result of a lawsuit that we spearheaded and instituted in 1973. And so what we have today on the Chicago Fire Department is a section called Appendix G. Appendix G was put in by Reverend Jackson. Reverend Jackson came in during the fire strike of 1980. And at the end of the strike, he was able to bring the city as well as the union together. He was able to get the city to hire 800 strike breakers, which is unheard of. No one has ever hired strike breakers, period. It has never been done. So they did do that in Chicago, as well as we were able to get 800 strike breakers hired, and what were some of the other benefits? We were able to go back to work. So he helped us salvage our humility, and we had a contract when we went back. So a lot of the gains that people are taking advantage of today are gains as a result of lawsuits that someone else instituted and they were able to take advantage of. So our numbers are low today across the board. Those numbers need to change in reference to hiring practices. And so we're constantly pushing for that. But it's a great book. It's a history book. It doesn't talk about me too much. It talks about how the fire department was formed, what the fire service looked like prior till, and it's basically a history book. So, any other questions? Would you like to be a fireman, sir? Mm-hmm. Would you? Yep. All right, you need to get in touch with the Black Fire Brigade then. I don't have their business card, but you can Google the Black Fire Brigade. They have an office at 8404 South Kedzie. Same thing with you, young lady, if you're interested. They are helping young people to become EMTs, and they assist them through the process of their applications for EMT license, and it's an excellent program. How old are you, sir? Mm-hmm. All right. One of the things that the fire department requires is that you be physically fit. So if you're not exercising, you want to start. So some of the things that you could do that don't cost you anything, you can do push-ups, you can do squats. I remember running around Ogden Park prior to me taking the exam, 1973, 1974. I ran 3 to 5 miles every day. I ate on an average of 3 times a day, 4 times a day, and I slept on an average of 10 hours a day. But not only did I run, but I lift weights as well at the time. And I placed 820 out of 20,000 people who took the exam. So my contention to affirmative action that I would have been hired anyway, I would think. But when a black person walks in the door, they always had excuses such as, for the police department, you had flat feet, and for black men, you were too short. So those criteria is what they would not allow you on the department. Since much of that has changed. One thing that I didn't mention, September 18th of this past year, I was able to get a resolution passed through City Council. My alderwoman of the 8th Ward, Michelle Harris, helped me with that project. September 18th, we were acknowledged with a resolution acknowledging, first of all, Engine 21, their invention of the sliding pole, them leading Chicago in first in, and the number of runs that they took in, the number of fires that they fought. I was acknowledged for my book. And then there's a family called the Enos Bond family. Enos Bond family I consider to be one of the oldest black families in Chicago. That family found their freedom during the Revolutionary War of 1776. Enos Bond served during the Civil War. This family came out of Vincennes, Ohio, which is Vincennes, Indiana, which is right outside of Cincinnati. This family relocated to Chicago in 1866. Enos became a police officer, particularly in the 1880s, early 1890s. His son served in World War I. Hod Bond. Served in World War I, was injured. He was shot in the leg. Same gentleman joined the fire department in Chicago in 1920. Unfortunately, Hod Bond was killed in the line of duty traveling to a fire. He was involved in an accident at 35th and Cottage Grove, where he was thrown from the apparatus and he suffered a broken neck. But this individual and his family found their freedom during the Revolutionary War, which is totally unheard of for the average black person. Why? Because many of us did not receive our so-called freedom until after 1865, the Civil War. So this family had experienced freedom, but we all know that even though they were not slaves, they were not totally free. They could not vote. Many couldn't vote. Many could not testify against a white person in court, and there may have been some other stipulations that they could not do. So, and before I conclude, I'd like to touch on the fact that I talked about the African Firemen's Association in 1818, who in Philadelphia attempted to start their own volunteer fire company. Well, 1818, New York, Molly Williams was considered the first female firefighter. She was a slave. Her slave master was a volunteer in the firehouse in New York, so she would go to work with him at the firehouse where he volunteered. She would cook and clean for its members. Well, one particular night it was a bad snowstorm and a lot of the firemen were ill, they were sick, and so with the flu, and as a result, she assisted by pulling a hose wagon, a fire hose cart down the street along with some other items, and she helped extinguish this fire. And as a result of her diligence and her hard work, they considered her their first woman firefighter. Now, maybe at the time it may have been a joke, but you know, it was not a joke because the irony in it is that New York is not far from Philadelphia. They would allow a black slave to serve in New York, but not 100 miles away in Philadelphia, 1818, the African Firemen's Association could not organize a volunteer organization, group of firemen, because they were not allowed to. So those slaves that served in the South, those slaves were used for manpower. And that was just the difference between the North and the South at that time. The North did not allow blacks to serve in the fire service, nor did they allow them to be police officers, even freedmen. But in the South, they were welcome. Black firemen and black freedmen as well as slaves were welcomed as firemen in the South. So it just shows you the irony and the difference between the North and the South and how they took care of their business. So I have some business cards for my book. If you're interested in purchasing one, you can always reach out there. Here you go, ma'am.
This one's free, right?
No, they're $25.
Oh, this is 25.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So that kind of concludes my discussion. Do you guys have any more questions? Your question was a legitimate one. You know, as I said, the Black Fire Brigade are helping people to get their EMT license, because what happens is when you go into the fire academy, once you're selected, you have to go through a 3-month course to become an EMT. And so you have to pass that before you can move on to the next level, which would be training to become a fireman. Now, you guys got to have some questions about, you know, did I go into any real good fires? Am I a real fireman? Was I a real fireman? I got that a lot, too. I had this
Any accidents?
Traffic accidents, or what kind of?
In the fire and the...
Yeah, I had a couple of roofs fall in on me. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I worked in this area when I first started, 69th and Bell Street.
How old were you when you started?
I was 24 years old when I started.
And you retired?
Yes, I retired in 2009. I was 55 years old, and 31 years was just enough. So I served in this community for about 1978 until 1983, 84. So I served at 69th and Bell Street. So I took in a number fire, Gaze Park Bowling Alley, 56 and Western. I was standing inside of that when it collapsed. And then just down the street from there, a year following, I was at a fire at a garage, 59th and Western, and we were on the top of that roof, and it collapsed. And I ended up hanging off the side of the wall looking at bricks. And a unique story is that I pulled myself back up on, true story, pulled myself back up on the coping, and there was a chief about 3 or 4 feet away from me, because there were a number of us up there on the roof. He was sliding off the wall. I went over, pulled myself up, went over, stabilized him by grabbing his belt so he wouldn't fall into the rubbish and rubble and whatever was going on below. And I made another fireman come up and help me pull him up. Well, need I say, I never got an award for that. So that just shows you how discrimination works. So I should have been awarded for that, wouldn't you think? I mean, I kept him from busting his butt, right? So, and so these are different things that we've had to contend with in the fire department. And so I know I'm getting away from you, but you got to be physically fit. You have to exercise regularly. You know, same thing, you know, running, push-ups, weightlifting. You have to get involved in the process. I find that many people who become firemen down the road knew somebody, they know someone in the fire service who can kind of give them insight as to how to get from point A to point Z. So if you have an interest, you're welcome to call me sometime. Whatever I can do to help, same thing with you. Whatever I can do to help, guide and direct you, you know, that doesn't cost anything.
Great.
So if you have any friends, you may want to let them know as well. So you have the card. If you're interested in a book, you can always contact
for
me.
your time.
Certainly, certainly, certainly. So I know you guys never heard any of these stories
No.
before, right? Black history, though.
Thanks, man.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you guys for coming.